Welcome back. In our last session, we began the discussion of the text of the Gospel of Matthew with the infancy narrative. In particular, we looked at the genealogy, which narrated the remote origins of Jesus, and then analyzed the narrative of the Annunciation to Joseph, which explained the proximate origins of Jesus the Messiah. In the current session, we continue our discussion of the infancy narrative with the narrative of the visit of the Magi, followed by a discussion of the narrative of the Massacre of the Holy Innocents and the corresponding flight into Egypt by the Holy Family. We conclude with the return of the Holy Family to the Holy Land and their settling in Nazareth. The second chapter of Matthew's Gospel divides into two major sections, 2:1-12 and 2:13-23, roughly the same length each. The first section constitutes the answer to the third of Stendel's questions that we discussed last time, where the narrative subdivides into two sections, 2:1-6, the Magi in Jerusalem, and 2:7-12, the Magi in Bethlehem. In these, there are several allusions and a citation of a text from the Old Testament. The second section narrates the aftermath of the Magi's visit, the flight into Egypt and the massacre of the innocents and the return to Nazareth. It answers the fourth of Stendel's questions, whence? In this narrative, we find the next three formula citations of the Gospel of Matthew. The Magi in Jerusalem cites Micah 5:1 and 2 Samuel 5:2. The Magi in Bethlehem alludes to Psalm 72:10-11 and Psalm 60, verse 6. The flight into Egypt cites Hosea 11:1. The Massacre of the Innocents cites Jeremiah 31:15, and the return to Nazareth has a formula citation of a text that is not readily identifiable from the Old Testament. The narrative of the visit of the Magi in Matthew 2:1-12 presents the appearance of the child Messiah to the Gentile world. Because three gifts are presented, it has been tradition that there were three Magi or wise men who encountered Jesus in the house of Mary and Joseph. The Magi narrative has significant Old Testament background. In particular, the narratives of the infancy and young manhood of Moses, found in the book of Exodus. The Magi narrative, as it is constructed in the Gospel of Matthew, seems to be an intertwining of two sources. The first would be a Magi source, which contains the narrative of the wise men from the east who saw the star of the King of the Jews and came westward toward Bethlehem and Jerusalem to pay homage to the newborn king. It was a belief of the Eastern astrologers that each of us has a star that appears in the heavens when we're born and disappears or falls from the heavens when we die. The greater the person, the greater the star. The second source would be a Herod source, which details Herod's intention to destroy this newborn king of the Jews. Notice, Joseph will appear in the narratives of the second source, but not the first. The Magi source would be drawn from the book of Numbers, in particular the narrative of Balaam, which is found in chapters 22-24 of the book of Numbers. That narrative describes a man from the east who predicted a star would rise from Jacob. From this two-source hypothesis, then, two questions emerge. If the Magi had the star to lead them, why then do they need Herod? And if Herod had the scriptures to direct him, why then did he need the Magi? The Magi needed Herod because the star that was leading them disappeared. And Herod needed the Magi because he did not, as a rule, consult the Hebrew Scriptures. The narrative begins simply telling us where Jesus was born, in Bethlehem of Judea. Note the use of the verb here is the proper verb for being born, genao, not the origin verb ginomai that we saw in chapter 1. The text goes on to give us the time of Jesus' birth. In the days of Herod the king. Herod was appointed king of the Jews in 40 BC. He gained control of Jerusalem in 37 BC and ruled until 4 BC when he died. Then the principal characters of the narrative are introduced. Magi from the east, who are traveling to Jerusalem. Harrington notes that the Magi were originally a caste of Persian priests with special claims to interpret dreams. Hagner carries this further, noting that since they were interested in a star, they were most likely astrologers who gained special insight into world affairs from their observation of the planets and the stars. The descriptor "from the east" has occupied the interest of many commentators. Brown, Hagner, and others have defined the east as 1. Parthia or Persia, an area clearly east of the land of Israel. The term Magi originated in this Persian area. Further, the Magi of the New Testament and later Christian art were depicted in Persian or Parthian dress. That's how they were depicted in mosaics of the Church of the Nativity. As a result, when the Persians came to destroy the church in 614 AD, they saw people dressed similar to their people in art on the walls, and spared the church. A second choice was Babylon, which is still not as far to the east. This was due to the interest of the Babylonians in astronomy and astrology. Further, after the exile in 587 to 539, a number of Jews remained in Babylon, and so it is possible that some of those Jews of first century Babylon were familiar with the messianic expectations. The third possibility was Arabia or the Syrian desert. This was cited because of the gifts that the Magi brought. Gold and frankincense are mentioned in Isaiah 60 verse 6 as coming from Midian, which is located in northwestern Arabia. Hagner opts for Babylon as the most likely candidate. They arrive in Jerusalem and ask regarding the newborn king of the Jews. The question was sure to pique the interest of Herod, who had himself been given the title King of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 28 AD. So this king would have been seen as a rival to Herod, and the Magi question was sure to arouse the suspicion and jealousy of Herod. They continue, "We have seen his star at its rising," ente anatole in Greek. A slight bit of Greek grammar is helpful here. The word Anatole without an article or a definite article, the te, is translated east in reference to the direction, as we saw above, Magi from the east. With the article, it's normally used in reference to the rising of a star, as it is here. That at its rising is the preferred translation here. For centuries, people have been interested in what the star really was. Topping the list of astral phenomena that could be called the star are a supernova, or a new star, a comet, or a planetary conjunction. Because it is described as appearing and disappearing, and it moves, the third possibility, planetary conjunction, seems most likely. Astronomers have calculated that Jupiter makes one orbit every 12 years, and Saturn makes one orbit every 30 years. They pass each other in conjunction every 20 years. Add a third planet, Mars, that passes shortly after the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, so that the three planets are in conjunction. This occurs once every 805 years. What's interesting is the astronomer Johannes Kepler witnessed this phenomenon in October of 1604. So, extrapolating back 805 years, we arrive at 799 AD. Go back another 805 years, and we arrive at approximately 7 to 6 BC. Kepler then calculated 3 points of conjunction: the months of May and June, the months of September and October, and the month of December of 7 BC. Mars is known to have passed early the next year. Such a conjunction of planets may have led Parthian or Persian astrologers to predict there would appear in Palestine among the Hebrews a world leader, ruler of the last days, the newborn king of the Jews. Then the Magi announced their purpose. We have come to worship him. Hagner notes that the verb translated as worship, proskuneo, is otherwise translated as pay homage to him. Worship is usually given to a divine being. Based on the experience of Jesus, Matthew's community knew that worship is the proper translation. Then Matthew narrates Herod's reaction to the Magi's question. This certainly is not good news for Herod. A newborn king of the Jews can only mean trouble. So Herod is troubled in the sense of agitated, and not only Herod, but all Jerusalem with him. This leads Herod to assemble the chief priests and the scribes of the people, the leaders, to inquire where the Christ was to be born. It's curious that Herod had to call upon experts to gain information every one of his subjects would have had readily available. This collaboration of Herod with the chief priests and the scribes may foreshadow another collaboration between these groups at the end of the gospel. The response of the experts is a citation of Micah 5:1, joined to 2 Samuel 5:2. This is considered by some as a formula quotation, but the lack of the fulfillment in the introduction and the lack of the formal introductory formula makes one question that. From Micah we have, "But you, O Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. From you shall come forth a ruler," and then from Samuel, the last line, "who will shepherd my people Israel." The link between the two texts is commonly held to be the connection between shepherding and ruling. Thus, the Messianic son of David would shepherd his people. And the deeper meaning here is that the child Jesus born in Bethlehem is that Messianic ruler of Judah, who will be shepherd and ruler of his people. Upon receiving this information from the experts on things Jewish, Herod summons the Magi secretly to inquire at what time the star appeared. Herod knows a little astrology, and he wishes to know the time of the star's appearance to get a hint of how old this child king may be. Then he gives the command to go and search for the child, the paideon, diligently, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may go and worship him. Now it's interesting that the word used to describe the young Jesus in this text is paidion, a young child, rather than the normal word for infant, brephos. We're talking years, not days, here since Jesus' birth. What Matthew has accomplished here is gaining an answer to the Magi's question while setting up the next two sections of the narrative, the flight into Egypt and the massacre of the innocents. Based on the Magi's information on the star's appearance, Herod will target children 2 years old and under, and his worship will actually be destruction. Before discussing the Magi at Bethlehem, we need to examine a couple of Old Testament texts that are alluded to in the narrative. The first is from the prophet Isaiah chapter 60, verse 6, which is a part of the first reading for the Feast of the Epiphany. Isaiah writes, "Caravans of camels shall fill you, dromedaries from Midian and Ephah. All from Sheba shall come, bearing gold and frankincense, and proclaiming the praises of the Lord." From this allusion we get the reference to one of the possible locations of the East, as was pointed out above. But more significantly, two of the three gifts are mentioned, gold and frankincense. Secondly, there's an allusion to Psalm 72, 10 through 11, which is part of the responsorial psalm for the Feast of the Epiphany. That psalm says, "May the kings of Tarshish and the islands bring tribute. The kings of Arabia and Seba offer gifts. May all the kings bow down before him, and nations serve him." Again, we get a notion of what may be meant by East. But again, and more importantly, we see that it's kings here that bring gifts. On the basis of this psalm, the Magi, astrologers, have been morphed into kings. And there suddenly were three of them, because, as I said before, they brought three gifts. The scene now switches from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, as the Magi, having heard the commands of Herod, went on their way. As they traveled, the star that they had seen at its rising, ente antole, note the same phrasing as chapter 2, went before them. The arrival of the star corresponds to their departure. Seeing the star, the Magi rejoiced greatly. This structure of a verb and a cognate object is a typical Hebrew construction. Thus, it's known as a Hebraism. Then they enter the house. This seems to be in contradiction to Luke, who has Jesus born in a stable. But the Greek word that Luke uses, katulama, can actually refer to a part of the house where animals were kept, and not necessarily a stable. More than likely, we're dealing with a house, the home of Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem, where Jesus' early years were spent. Upon entering the house, they see the child with Mary, his mother. It's curious that Joseph does not appear in this narrative. Hagner notes that it was because Mary is considered to be central at this point. They have then reached their destination. The star is over the place where the child was. The star then has accomplished its purpose. It's led the Magi to the Christ child. Then they fall down and they worship. They were now accomplishing the very task for which they set out on the trip. Then they opened their treasures and offered the child gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Much has been made of the meaning of the three gifts of the three Magi. Generally, it's accepted that gold is a sign of kingship. Hence, the gift of gold acknowledges that this child is a king. And many have seen the response of the believer in light of this is to be virtuous. The second gift, frankincense, is a sign of divinity. Hence, this child who is a king is also divine. In this child, God is present among his people. The Christian response to this gift is prayer. The third gift is the most unusual of all, myrrh. Myrrh, plain and simple, is a burial spice. It's not the usual gift that one would give to a young child. Clearly, it is a foreshadowing of what will ultimately happen to this child. The Christian response to this gift is suffering. Thus, the three gifts symbolize that this child is a king who is divine, who will suffer and ultimately die. The whole of the gospel, then, the whole of the life of Christ is encapsulated in these gifts. Here is a picture of some frankincense. It's burned by putting it on the burning coals, which causes it to melt, giving off its pleasant aroma, and makes smoke which rises to the heavens. Through the centuries, people have wanted to describe and name these three magi. Such a description follows from the Excerpta et Collectiana of the Venerable Bede, dating around AD 700. It gives the traditional names of the Magi and hints that they may have been representative of the various races of the day. The Magi were the ones who gave gifts to the Lord. The first is said to have been Melchior, an old man with white hair and a long beard, who offered gold to the Lord as to a king. The second, Gaspar by name, a young and beardless and ruddy complexioned, honored him as God by his gift of incense, an oblation worthy of divinity. The third, black-skinned and heavily bearded, named Balthazar, by his gift of myrrh, testified to the Son of Man who was to die. The narrative ends with yet another dream, however this time without an angel. They are not to return to Herod. Rather, the Magi are to depart Bethlehem and return to their own country via a different route. There are a variety of ways that the Magi could have returned. In any case, they are to avoid Jerusalem. This map shows Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The Magi could have traveled north along the seacoast following trade routes on the coastal plain, through Sepphoris and Capernaum to Damascus, and then turned east. Or they could take the trade route through Nabatea and Philadelphia east of the Jordan, going south, and then turn east. Almost immediately upon the departure of the Magi, we learn of Herod's reaction to their failure to return to him. It is the content of the next two sections of the infancy narrative: the flight into Egypt and the massacre of the innocents. Joseph re-enters the narrative to be warned in a dream by an angel. Again, we have the typical angelic dream pattern. It begins with an introductory clause connecting to the Magi narrative, when they, the Magi, had gone away. Then the typical "behold" announces an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. This is almost the same as the narrative of chapter 1. The angel then issues two commands to Joseph. Get up and take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. Then, continuing to follow the angelic dream pattern we talked about, the angel gives a reason for the commands. For Herod is going to search for the child and destroy him. Here we have the first inkling of Herod's intent. The verb destroy, by the way, will also appear in the Passion narrative at Matthew 27:20. Then Joseph obeys the angel, and he gets up and takes the child, the Paideon, and his mother, and they went away to Egypt, where they stay until the death of Herod. Egypt is chosen because of the parallel to Moses and the Exodus traditions. Also, later rabbinic tradition knows of Jesus' sojourn in Egypt, attributing his supernatural powers to magic that he learned there. Now, the second generally accepted formula citation of Matthew's Gospel occurs. It's introduced by the standard formula, "This was to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet." He then proceeds to cite Hosea 11:1. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." But note, Matthew makes two changes in the Greek Septuagint text. The Septuagint uses the verb metakalein, namely summoned, where Matthew uses the verb kalein, to call. That change is not that significant, as the one is the compound of another. The more significant alteration is the changing of the Septuagint tekna, children, to huios, which is son. This alteration serves to emphasize the current situation, where God is going to call his son Jesus out of Egypt to return to Nazareth at the end of the chapter. Through the use of this text from Hosea, there's a direct reference to the Exodus. Matthew wishes to show that God's call of Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus was a type of Jesus, his son, going down into Egypt, leading to God's eventually calling Jesus out from Egypt. Jesus is thus portrayed as the embodiment of a new Israel, which will become the church. This we will see developed as the gospel unfolds. The dream of Joseph telling him to take Mary and the child to Egypt formed the prelude to the next unit of the infancy narrative, the Massacre of the Innocents. Here we discover the true intention of Herod in speaking with the Magi. Not adoration, but destruction. Herod worried about a pretender ever since he met with the Magi. Now he intensifies in anger, seeing that the Magi refuse to follow his request. He takes it as an affront. And so he sends his soldiers to eliminate all male children in Bethlehem and in the surrounding region 2 years old and under, based on the report of the Magi. Later writers in the early church listed the number of deaths here at 14,000 in the Byzantine tradition, 64,000 in the Syrian tradition, but most likely, given the population of that region and the time, the total number of infants murdered was between 10 and 30. Here we see a rather graphic depiction of the Massacre of the Innocents from a fresco in the crypt church of the Visitation in Ein Kerem. Interestingly, we note that toward the left there is an angel directing Elizabeth away from the soldiers, as Elizabeth is carrying John the Baptist. One might not realize that John was also in danger from that massacre. The third formula citation follows. The introductory formula differs from the previous in that it does not show the citation to express purpose. Many have surmised that this is so because Matthew does not want to ascribe evil purposes to God. This is also shown in the fact that it is the prophet who speaks, not the Lord through the prophet. Matthew simply says, "Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah." The citation is from Jeremiah 31:15. It is in general agreement with the Septuagint text. Jeremiah 31:15 depicts the captives being rounded up by Nebuchadnezzar's army at the town of Ramah, from which they were taken to their exile in Babylon. Rachel, who died near Ramah, just outside of Bethlehem, is depicted as the archetypal grieving mother. Thus, a voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, not this time for sons being taken to exile, but for young sons massacred by the soldiers of Herod. Rachel weeping for her children, she refused to be consoled. Just as Rachel wept for the departing exiles, so here she weeps for the killed young babies in Bethlehem. To this day, Rachel's tomb still stands as one enters Bethlehem from Jerusalem, as can be seen from this picture. But Jeremiah's text is not all mourning. 2 verses later, Jeremiah says, "There is hope for your future, says the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country." Jeremiah 31:17. The completion of the story of the Magi is the return of the Holy Family to Nazareth. One of the purposes of this extended text is Matthew's answer to the question of how Jesus could be born in Bethlehem, yet grow up in Nazareth. The first part of the infancy narrative shows the birth in Bethlehem. This section explains how they got from Bethlehem to Nazareth. Again, there is a dream, where an angel communicates to Joseph. The introductory clause, as we have seen in the past, connects this narrative to the preceding. It gives the time when Herod died. There is little dispute that Herod the Great died in 4 BC. Then the angel appears in a dream to Joseph, giving a command. "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go back to the land of Israel." Then the reason for the return is given. "For those who were seeking the child's life are dead." The situation that had called for their departure to Egypt has been alleviated, and so they can return. The language here is nearly verbatim to the language that's used in the book of Exodus for the return of Moses to Egypt after he had fled for his life in Exodus 4:19. Then the execution of the angel's command by Joseph is narrated. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went back to the land of Israel. The presumption would be that he returned to his home in Bethlehem. Upon the death of Herod the Great, his kingdom was divided into 4 sections, each known as a tetrarchy, from the Greek words for rule of a quarter. Rule, arche, quarter, tetera, hence tetrarch. The extreme southern region, the region of Judea, was given to Herod's son Archelaus. The next northernmost region, Samaria and Galilee, was given to his son Antipas. The region north of Galilee, Iturea and Trachonitis, was given to Herod's son Philip, and the northernmost region, Abilene, was given to Lysanias, of whom very little is known. Joseph comes to know that Archelaus had become ruler in the region of Judea, including Bethlehem, succeeding his father Herod. Joseph was not that positive in returning to his old homeland because it would seem Archelaus' reputation was that of being more ruthless than his father. History would prove Joseph's fears, as Archelaus would be removed by his subjects about 10 years later in 6 A.D. Being warned in yet another dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Now Galilee was under the authority of yet another son of Herod the Great, as we saw, Herod Antipas. But his reputation was that he was a much more tolerant ruler than his half-brother Archelaus. The constant reappearance of God's messenger in dreams to Joseph signals throughout this narrative the divine care of the child, the Son of God. More specifically, Joseph arrives in Galilee and takes up residence in the city of Nazareth. Nazareth was an agricultural village not far from the main trade route from Egypt to Egypt on the Via Maris. Little is known of Nazareth, as it does not appear in the Old Testament, and was considered to lie uninhabited during most of the Old Testament period, being reestablished in the 3rd century, perhaps by exiles returning from Babylon. The infancy narrative closes with the 4th and final formula citation of the narrative, introduced with the formula that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. Note that there is a reference to the prophets, not a single prophet. This is the only time that Matthew makes reference to prophets. Hence, he may be taking this as a theme found in several prophets. The specific wording of the citation, "he shall be called a Nazarene," is found nowhere in the Old Testament or ancient rabbinic literature. The term Nazarene, according to Harrington, has 3 principal derivations. First, it's concerned with the town of Nazareth, mentioned above. Second, it could be connected with the term Nazir, as one devoted to God or one consecrated to God, that is, one who has taken the Nazirite vow, such as Samson in the book of Judges. And finally, it could be connected to the Hebrew term netzer, meaning branch, joining it to the prophecy of the branch that will grow from the stump of Jesse that we saw in Isaiah 11:1. Many throughout history have taken the text of Isaiah 11:1 as a messianic text. We must recall that the messianic figure of Isaiah 11:1 is the Emmanuel of Isaiah 7:14. Thus, the final formula citation of Matthew connects itself to the original first formula citation of Matthew. This concludes our discussion of the infancy narrative in Matthew. Next time we'll begin the public ministry of Jesus, presenting the one who paved the way for Jesus, John the Baptist. After a discussion of John's ministry, we shall turn to the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the baptism and the temptation. See you then.